Hello everyone, I am Morgan Baker and today I'm going to be talking about deaf accessibility tools, when and how to use them. This presentation will specifically define a couple tools to promote deaf accessibility in video games, as well as mentioned, when and how to integrate them into our game design. So let's just dive straight into it. I'm going to start off by very quickly introducing myself. I am Morgan and I'm a full-time disability specialist for the University of Southern California. In addition to this role, I provide accessibility consultation to varying studios. Most recently, I worked with Naughty Dog on The Last of Us Part 2, which was very cool. And I'm also right now a design consultant for Exploding Kittens and have also recently worked on other small projects like companies like Microsoft. And for my everyday role, though, I work with hundreds of people with disabilities to create equal access. And if there's one takeaway that I have just been emphasizing again and again is that there's no such thing as one disabled experience. And this is especially true for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. So some people are born deaf, whereas others may lose their hearing later in life. Also, deafness itself is a spectrum and can range from mild all the way to profound. Some people use hearing aids or maybe no sign language, or others perhaps cochlear implants, or they might not choose to use any hearing devices at all, just for personal or medical purposes. So I always use me as an example. I went deaf in my teenage years. I learned sign language, as well as I also have two cochlear implants and I voice, as you can tell. But though some deaf people relate to me, we are all still very different. We have different experiences. And so how can we design our games to be as accessible as possible to all these different experiences for deaf and hard of hearing players? And so today I'm going to be talking about the two major tools to promote deaf accessibility in video games. The first is captions and subtitles, and the second are visual cues. And this is a very basic guide. And I'll also too, it's going to be very example heavy to help us kind of synthesize the information. So just very quickly, captions and subtitles represent dialogue and sound effects through displayed text. In fact, you can, during this presentation, actually hit captions on, I think it's the bottom right, and you can see it right there. Someone is actually creating live captions. We also have our second tool, which is visual cues, which notify users of pertinent information so that we can make informed decisions. So a famous example that we are all kind of familiar with is in Metal Gear Solid. We have that kind of exclamation point, which is accompanied by its iconic sound effect. I want to also say, though, please keep in mind that either of these tools can be either integrated into the video game or can be presented within the settings as options to turn on. So let's delve into our first tool, closed captions and subtitles. Now, actually, these are technically a little different. Subtitles are dialogue only, whereas closed captions are dialogue and sound effects. Considering just subtitles, they derive from the text in written and spoken script. For example, if the dialogue is in another language, subtitles can provide a thorough and accurate translation for non-native speakers. And here I have a quick example from Red Dead Redemption 2, where we observe Micah represented in the color gray in his name, and he's stating quite a business. The term closed caption is a little different because it also includes indicators such as like music, background noise, maybe like explosion, gunshot, or breaking glass. And as a tool, closed captions are almost always designed under the assumption that the person who's going to be using them is deaf or hard of hearing. And the main benefits is that they just provide additional context to help improve immersion for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. They're especially important if you have a game and it has a lot of cinematics. Closed captions are absolutely the way to go rather than subtitles. So here I have a quick example from It's a Dog's Life with Bill Farmer, where we observed an unlabeled white man stating, "Oh no, that was birds." And in parentheses, we see after the line chuckles, all capitalized, and notice how his kind of tone is captured through that phrase chuckles. It actually gives us a little more context of his intonation. as he's laughing at his own words, and that's really helpful. I know myself as a deaf individual, I really appreciate when people label tone, especially if it relates to the current conversation. Now, that we discussed this tool, I list here a couple best practices for captions and subtitles, and it's a very long list. I'm actually just going to put this on my website too, leahybaker.com. But I'm just going to read it over really, really quickly for best practices for captions and subtitles. The biggest one is making sure things are accurate. We want to make sure we're labeling our speakers. We want to, again, talk about that tone and emotion within the actual subtitles if it's relevant, and also making sure that we label music in its source, but only when required. That'll also help a lot with giving context. And the last is for sound effects, and I actually provide a couple examples. For example, when you do sound effects, you want to make sure you're describing the sound, not action. So instead of saying gun being shot, you would say gunfire. And I'm just going to include all this information on my website, so if you want to delve into the specifics, you have it there. The next slide again provides a little bit more. For example, I discuss the font needs to be simple and legible. The size needs to be basically as big as possible, I always say. And the text background, we want to make sure it properly contrasts the text in the background itself, so it pops out and it's easy to read. Colors, we want to make sure that we're using standard legible colors such as white, yellow, cyan, or green. These are what are suggested by BBC, who did some pretty thorough research to determine that those are 4 very good colors. From there, the length, we want to make sure 2 to 3 lines at a time and 38 characters per line maximum, because otherwise it's going to be a very chunky caption. We don't want that. And the breaking points in the text, we want to make sure it's legible. So between line 1 and 2, it needs to be logical and legible. But in this case, particularly logical. So going from 1 to 2, the breaking point is natural. There's actually going to be an example for this one, so it might help further understand. But let's just delve in. I have a couple examples here. The first is Gears of War 5. This is a great example where the text is an appropriate size, the background properly contrasts. We actually see here they use something that's called like letterboxing. Folks in the UK say it that way, where essentially you use a kind of black, sometimes blue box behind the text that maybe is opaque or slightly transparent to kind of guarantee that the text will always contrast. And so we see Gears of War 5, they do it here. So it makes it very easy to read. The next example here we have Darkest Dungeon, or not Darkest Dungeon, here's Darkest Dungeon. The text is not a standard color and it does not contrast with the background and it just is not legible. Also, it's in the top center, which is not standard. It's normally in the bottom center. Not the biggest to do, but it's something else we need to be mindful of. From here, another example, the one I was trying to mention earlier from Shadow the Tomb Raider. The text perfectly contrasts. It's easy to read. It's legible. It's large. It's white. It's thick. It's great. However, we have an unnatural line break here where it says, Jonah, I'm here. Just a little stuck. A rock pinned my enter leg. And that's not really good, especially right now we see the screen grab and it doesn't look like a big to-do, but when that continually keeps happening, especially back to back, it really makes things difficult to read and understand long term. And then readers, we have to focus more on the text rather than watching the actual cinematic, which for video games, interactive media, we don't want that. We want to enjoy our entertainment and watch, what's going on. We also have an example from Outcast Second Contact, where the text is way too long for users to read and comprehend in the inappropriate amount of time, thus just slowing down the general gameplay. However, I do want to point out that the actual text itself, they pick a pretty good font and they have that beautiful white that pops out. We have letterboxing. Again, they use kind of like a transparent blue color to make the text guarantee pop out for readers, and that is a wonderful thing, and I'm very happy to see that. And for our last example, Assassin's Creed, textbook perfect. It's appropriate in length, uses text color with a suitable background to contrast it, and plus, as extra credit, it identifies a speaker using the BBC guidelines of having it capitalized. So that's great. But what is the biggest takeaway? No matter what you do, just make sure it's consistent. Whether you decide to make things capital or use this color or maybe use brackets, just make sure it's the same. And don't be afraid to experiment a little bit, but at the end of the day, keep in mind that folks are going to need to be able to read. So for the next tool, the second half, we have visual cues. And what are they? Again, they're used in game design to notify users of pertinent gameplay information so that they can just make informed decisions. And so a couple examples I include here and have damage directional indicators, pathfinding hints, timing cues during combat. So like let's say someone has a sword and it glints before it drops down, that's a visual cue. And also just generally highlights over loops and drops. That's very helpful. So here is a couple examples. We have Valorant, where we have an example of a user taking damage, and the game actually is notifying them through a damage directional indicator. We can see here on the left side, there's kind of a red arc around the crosshair in the center, and it's just showing that they're taking an amount of damage on the left side of them. The next example here, Last of Us Part 2, an example where a user is receiving a pathfinding hint. And again, this is really great just in terms of general design and also accessibility. And the last example here I chose from Remnant from the Ashes, which is an example of a user being visually notified of drops, where one of the drops is highlighted in green and the other one is highlighted in kind of like a bright orange red. So now that we talked about visual cues, we have our subtitles, we have our visual cues, but why do we use these tools? And honestly, the short answer is that accessibility just involves interactive and integrated design. We need to use these tools because they need to make the game accessible. It's just, there's universal benefits for it, and also too, it's just the right thing to do. And for when we use the tools, I always say my shortest answer is as early as possible. The reasoning is that oftentimes foundational design choices prevent the application of an accessible feature. So let's say once the game enters its kind of late production stages, it's extremely hard to go back and say like, hey, remember all the sound effects we made? Turns out none of them are accessible. And sure, like you can just slap on some subtitles, but what about other sound cues? And so there's just going to be a lot of backtracking, potentially a lot of last minute imperfect solutions. And as designers and developers, we don't want that. So this leaves us to my final question. How do we integrate these deaf accessibility tools in our video games? To help answer this question, I'm actually going to walk through some examples and scenarios that I think will be helpful for us. And I know too, again, if you need to go back and read more information on those visual cues, on the captions, especially for the last kind of like best practices, I will put it on my website so you can read at your own pace. But let's talk about a couple examples of how we implement deaf accessibility tools. What do we do if we have a story-driven game? If the gameplay is intended to be story-driven with extensive dialogue, then the designers need to create thorough and comprehensive closed captions. And here actually I use the same example from Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which includes detailed, comprehensive subtitles throughout the entire game. But what do we do if that dialogue happens off screen? If the dialogue occurs off screen, closed captions can include directional indicators to alert users of the source. So for example, I include here from The Last of Us Part 2, combat is actually subtitled, as well as uses directional indicators to let deaf and hard of hearing users know the enemy's location. From here, we see in the image that directional indicator on the left side of the subtitle. So it says WLF soldier, and they say this is dumb, we should be pushing in, and it's kind of angled, let's see, northwest. So we know that it's northwest of where we currently are standing. And this notifies deaf gamers of the source of the speech, as well as help them kind of resituate themselves to look for the speaker. Or in my case, if it's an enemy, I run away because I'm a baby. I'm like, oh no, there's a WLF soldier over there, better run. Whereas other people might say, oh, there's a soldier over there, let's take them on. And that's fun because then we can use the deaf accessibility tool to let people, again, make those informed decisions. But what do we do if we have a combat-driven game? So a major issue in combat-driven games is that off-screen events and alerts will often happen, and they'll only notify the users through an audio cue. So what do we do to make combat-driven games accessible? And I propose 3 general practices, but obviously this is not a set list. As for everything else, this is not set. These are just some suggestions. So the first is making a visual cue. I actually provide an example here from Call of Duty where Sledgehammer Games includes a directional visual cue to alert users that there is a grenade that's off screen that could be dangerous. So there's kind of in front of this screen, slightly below where the center is a circle, and it has like a little grenade icon, and then it's pointing towards south. So that kind of tells the user, oh, it's below me or behind me, and so I have to like turn around and see where it is. So it's very, very helpful. But we can also express the events and alerts through text, such as closed captions. It is a viable route depending on the game and the context of the game. So here I provide an example from Overwatch where all of the key voice lines are included in closed captions to notify the users that an ability is being used. So I'm trying to see, like, for example, it says May, freeze, don't move. So she's using her ultimate in that moment. And so we see by reading that, oh, she's using her ultimate. And actually, it's kind of cool because hearing people do the same thing, if they hear May say freeze, don't move, they're like, oh, she's using her ultimate, but now we can just read it too. So that's really great. But in other instances, you can also just use both. And that's very helpful too. You can have visual cues and you can caption it. And the benefit is that the user is alerted of off-screen events while also receiving direct knowledge of what is causing the sound. And again, this is all contextual with whatever game that you're playing. But for example, here I include Far Cry New Dawn, where in addition to that dialogue being captioned, it says, Mickey, whoever are you on that train, listen up. We also see a little caption that says explosion, and it's to like the right-ish side as a visual cue. And it actually also has a directional indicator, so we can see the word explosion, and then it's pointing to it looks like kind of slightly northeast. So we know that there's an explosion going on over there. And that, again, is a viable route. It just depends on the game and what you want to do to make sure that deaf players have equal access. But what do we do when we have a competitive game? So during competitive games, users need to receive really critical information as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And typically designers will use audio cues. We see that all the time, as hearing individuals can subconsciously obtain the information through auditory processing. However, unsurprising, this doesn't work for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. So the best course of action is to visualize the sound effects. So for example, Fortnite uses the revolutionary visualization for all the sound effects. Within the visualization, there are visual cues such as like for the treasure chest, gliders, gunshots, and footsteps. And additionally, this visual cue also includes colors to kind of help us easily identify which item it is. So like for example, like treasure chests are yellow, footsteps are white. And they also too, what's really nice is that they use opacity to indicate the distance of the actual sound cue. Also, nice thing is that the colors are help distinguish which sounds are neutral versus dangerous. Like gunshots are red, whereas footsteps are white. So this is a great example. I suggest if you're very curious, you should go read more about Fortnite and its accessibility options. It's like, mwah, beautiful. It's perfect. Um, how do we improve player communication? So team-based first-person shooters are extremely popular these days, and for many online games, they require a lot of player communication. However, voice chat is the most obvious barrier for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. And again, the first most obvious solution is to let the deaf gamers use the text chat to communicate with others to clarify information. So I include an example here from League of Legends, and it's especially doable, these text chat, if it's maybe a slower paced game, kind of similar to League of Legends. But given the fact that the nature of other online games are really fast, that's not always the most efficient way. So text chat can actually inhibit users or even place them at a disadvantage as they're spending more time reading and typing rather than actually maybe searching for gear or engaging in combat. So other solutions, well, on this slide, we have a suggestion for a comprehensive ping system or a CAN chat. It just depends on the game. Having a precise and flexible ping system improves player communication as users are able to quickly and efficiently provide information to their teammates. And so this example here I have is from Apex Legends, and they're celebrated for their wonderful ping system, but we also have other games like Hyperscape, Rocket League, they have a great CAN chat. And so it's another way to help improve player communication. And the last one that is doable is converting speech to text. Now, this solution is functional, but there's still a chance that the conversion is inaccurate due to poor microphone quality, background noises, accents, or just general incoherent speech. However, companies have proven it is good enough to show a substantial benefit to deaf and hard of hearing players. So I have the example here from Apex Legends, but I do recall Hyperscape introduced the speech to text, which is also really great, and we're seeing that more and more as more first-person shooters are coming out. So that's great. But my next point is, what do we do if the game relies on music? Now, I don't know why this is a really common design question I get from people, largely because I guess there's like a stereotype that deaf people are unaware of music and rhythm. And just to clear the air, I can say with 100% confidence that deaf people know music and rhythm very, very well. And it's actually a really large portion of deaf culture. But how can we make these music-based games accessible to deaf gamers as well? And so I use the example here from Cadence of Hyrule, which came out last year in 2019. And the great thing about it is that Brace Yourself Games cleverly integrates a visual heavy interface that relies that also like matches with the audio cues. And so it's really cool. I don't have a video here, but I highly suggest y'all Google it. But in the actual game, the enemies pulse to the music, and then actually in the bottom center, it actually has like a grid to help show the beat so we know when to move, because the game you're supposed to make your turns on each beat. And so it's actually perfectly visualized here to alert users on when to make their next move. And so it's really great. The entire game is extremely accessible to deaf and hard of hearing players, and that's something I love to see. But let's move on. This is the last example I have for you today, is what do we do with in-game stealth mechanics? So whether it be the user completely completing a stealth mission, or maybe enemies sneaking up on the user's character, this is just a common pain point for deaf and hard of hearing users for like in-game stealth mechanics. Like I cannot tell you how many times I've played a game and I just, died or lost the game because just like a random person just like attacked me. Or because I was trying to be stealth and I didn't realize I was making a lot of noise and then they saw me, which that happens quite frequently. Not a lot, but enough that it's doable as a point. So my first suggestion is using an integrated noise indicator. So for example here, Breath of the Wild, which is some of y'all might know, one of my favorite games, Nintendo actually added a noise indicator in their most recent Zelda installment, which is represented here. We can see the left to the right. The circle with pink on the bottom left within it, it notifies users of how loud they are. And so it's really, really great because users may not be aware that maybe one weapon is quieter than another, but the noise indicator will let us know the noise levels, and it's just an extremely effective tool. But what do we do if an enemy, is sneaking up and we're not sure where they are? I always say the best practice is awareness indicators, which will warn users when an enemy is about to spot them, which direction the enemy is coming from, etc. And so awareness indicators assist in both stealth and combat, as well as it lets users just maybe know who's sneaking or charging up. So here's an example of The Last of Us Part 2, where the player is notified by the HUD that they are no longer in stealth and that the enemy on the left, let's see, it's like the northwest side of them, can hear and see them. And then another overall example is just adding a really comprehensive mini-map that identifies all enemy locations through visual cues. Doing so will paint a very clear picture of enemy locations and leaving room for interpretation and more room for tactical decision making. So here's an example from Red Dead Redemption 2, which has a mini map. I've blown it up here on my side, that includes icons representing locations, encounters, friendly, enemy, player, NPCs, the whole 9 yards. And so it's just really a wonderful practice, and I would love to see more of that. So concluding thoughts, let's revisit very quickly. We have our two tools, and we kind of went over a bunch of examples of having both of them integrated together to create an accessible experience. We have closed captions and subtitles, which represent dialogue through sound effects and display text. And we also have visual cues, which notify users of pertinent information. And we kind of saw that bit of overlap, whether it be like Ubisoft, Microsoft, PlayStation, all these companies, indie games, Cadence Survival, they're all doing it, and it really is wonderful. And today, though, I talked about a number of ways that we can use these tools, but today's presentation only scratches on the surface. And as designers and developers, we can definitely make our games more accessible. And keep in mind, though, that this is not, again, a set list. It's just scratching on the surface and to help get you started and help think about ways that we can make our games accessible. And honestly, I'm just really looking forward to our extremely accessible future. So, as I mentioned, this presentation and slides can be found on my website, leahybaker.com, where I will update it as needed. There'll also be kind of a rough transcript for those who just want to follow along that way. Thank you so much again for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me at momoxmia.com, or you can just tweet at me at momoxmia. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.